Welcome to everybody. Thank you very much for being with us at the 7th episode of the podcast series Get in the Zone. Today we have alongside us a well-known academic and practitioner sports psychologist, associate professor in sport and exercise psychology currently at the University of Suffolk, Alexander Latinjak. Alex, thank you very much for honoring us with your presence here in this special podcast episode.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Nice to meet you. The goal of this podcast is, first of all, to learn some stuff about our interlocutor and guest, and then to discuss about the very interesting tool called PsychMapping, a scientifically based exploratory interview tool created by Alex and Eduardo Morello Tomas, another well-known practitioner in the head of sports psychology department currently in the Spanish Football Club Athletic Bilbao and previously for quite a few years in Villarreal. So, Alex, can you tell us first in more detail something more about your background in sports psychology and what led you to develop the psych mapping tool? And of course, if I said something wrong in my introduction about you and Eduardo, please correct me.
No, I mean, it was all right. I would always add that Edu is probably the best sports psychologist in the world. But that's the honorific title I give him. And in my case, so I'm an academic mainly, so I earn my money working for the university as a teacher and researcher. But I've been in applied practice since 2001. Since my first year at the university, I was working already with tennis players, and I've worked with tennis, talent development, professional tennis mainly. Then I worked a little bit in football, a little bit in golf, a little bit in sailing. And recent years, I've worked with Olympic athletes. We are right now working with Olympic athletes in preparation for the 2024 Olympic Games in Paris. I've been with a basketball club who is playing first division in Spain, and I'm still overseeing that program. I've done some work in Ipswich Town until the pandemic. Ipswich Town is now a championship football club in the UK. Mm-hmm. And now we're also working with sports like MotoGP, for example. So I have this dual career, to say so, the academic side and the applied side. Now, academically, I became a self-taught researcher. In the very early years when I started working as a sports psychologist, I had absolutely no idea what I could do to help athletes. And one thing that I could think of is making them repeat cue words. So to turn the instructions of their coaches into cue words so they would remember more and think more about what they had to do while practicing, especially tennis players who would practice about 5 hours a day. And from that, I did my master's dissertation in self-talk, and I did my PhD in self-talk. Mm-hmm. And my journey was pretty typical academically. It's a journey of over-specialization. So you start being interested in sports, and because you can't study all sports, you have to select some science. Some would study sports sciences, some might study physical education, some might study sociology, economics, or marketing. I studied psychology, but I was interested in sports. So after 4 years of psychology studies at the University of Barcelona, I did what most people would do. You select a master's and you get even more specialized. So within psychology, now I specialize on sports psychology. And I spent 2 years on my master's, and then I continued doing a PhD. And my PhD was on self-talk or cognitive self-regulation. So for a year or two, you start reading and reading and reading about cognitive self-regulation within the specific area of sports psychology, within the area of psychology. And then you get to the point where you develop your thesis, which was self-talk intervention. And I worked a couple of years on self-talk interventions, and even after the PhD for 8-9 years. And I became, and I would say with all the confidence, I'm a world-leading expert in self-talk research. We wrote a book. I'm invited to conferences, and there's hardly anyone who can discuss anything theoretical about self-talk with me. The problem is that I was interested in sports. And I already selected psychology as a type, as a sub-area of sport. Then sports psychology is a sub-area of psychology. Then cognitive self-regulation is a sub-area within sports psychology. And now I'm self-talk researcher, which, even though I'm very good at, it explains only a thousandth part of an athlete's reality. Self-talk is just a small, tiny bit, and we call that over-specialization. That's typical in the academic journey. And the sooner you drop out, the more general your view is, the further you go down that rabbit hole of academic development, the more narrow you get. And I was really narrow. When I managed to write a book or co-edit a book about self-talk in sports. But it came to a point where you realize that all that you know represents so little that you can't really answer any real world questions. So I wanted to take a step back and create an integrative review of what sport and exercise psychology was about. So I read about 600 articles. They're all review articles, theoretical articles. And I just asked myself, what is it about? What is sports psychology today? And we created something that we call the knowledge map of sport and exercise psychology. It's a published paper. It's interesting. I think it's a nice thing. It defines sport and exercise psychology based on everything we have studied. At least in my case, it went far beyond what I thought sports psychology was. Now, based on the knowledge map, then Edu Morillo asked me if we can do something with what is the theory useful for. At the beginning, it didn't have to serve any purpose. It was just, something I wanted to do. But we gave it a purpose and we said, look, we all doing exploratory interviews. We all talk with our athletes. We try and get to understand who they are. And we create a list of questions, almost random questions, whatever we think we have to ask, we ask. We try to be as holistic as possible, but we basically guess. And I said, now we have a theory about everything that sport and exercise psychology is. Let's use it to create a tool with what we can explore athletes. And that's how we created the basic psych mapping exercise. First, it was just Edu and I who used it in our applied practice, and then Lucia, who's the third author of the article, also used it in industry research, actually, within BT, British Telecom cybersecurity team. And then, Edu asked me, because Edu had this great team of sports psychologists at Villarreal, and if we could teach them, and we taught them about the tool, and other people joined those sessions. And then we opened up and we offered those sessions generally to sports psychologists around the world during the pandemic on weekend courses. And then we created an online, like now we have an online course at the University of Suffolk that everybody can do for very little money. We created a community and it became a thing. So that's a bit my background, and that's how we got to psych mapping.
Very nice. Thank you for a detailed view at your background and your interests. Of course, in my opinion, self-talk is really useful in sports psychology practice. As you say, it is a matter of over-specialization, but still an integrated part of practicing. You have to know how to help the athlete or whoever your client is in using self-talk and regulating self-talk in a constructive way, helpful way for him. But from my experience, being trained and starting using sports psych mapping, I think it is a really, really useful, and as you said, the key word that for me is holistic tool that you can use with athletes and with people from other fields. But let's delve more into psych mapping. How does the psych mapping tool work, and what are its key features? Can you tell us so that everybody gets to know more about it?
Yes, I will try. We do have some videos also on YouTube, and they might be a good complement once you listen to what I explain, because seeing it is better than just hearing it. But let's see if I can create you a verbal visual image of what it is. So in its essence, it's an interview between a consultant and a client. And you can do it online, you can do it in person. If you do it in person, let me go to the person version. The online is very similar. You sit next to your client, so not in front, you sit next to them, and in front of you lies an A3 printout map. It's basically a white piece of paper with that's split into three areas. On the left, it says external factors. In the middle, it says personal descriptors. On the right, it says psychological skills or self-regulation. And that's what you're going to do. You're going to fill out that empty piece of paper with aspects that are important for your client, for a topic of your client, related to the external factors that influence, the personal descriptors that describe your client, and the psychological skills your client has, specifically to that, who they are, to the external factors they encounter. The other part of PsychMapping is a set of question cards. I used to print them out. I have them plastified. They're like playing cards, a little bit bigger. And on those cards, there are 13 right now. We're developing a new version. It might be 14. But there are 13 question cards, some dedicated to exploring external factors, some dedicated to exploring personal descriptors, and some dedicated to exploring psychological skills or self-regulation. On each question card, you have a question, you have some images and some examples that should guide your client in finding the answers that are relevant to them. So you can't even give those cards to your clients so they have full control over what is happening. But you would read a question card like something like, I need to step one step back. Before you start, you establish a topic for the interview. So a default topic would be well-being and performance. But sometimes an athlete who comes or a client who comes with a specific need, something like, competitive anxiety, you can do the whole interview on that specific topic. And then you take the question card. And one question card, for example, asks, who are important people related to the topic? So who are important people related to your performance? Or who are important people related to your well-being, or who are important people related to your performance anxiety? The client answers, and what you as a practitioner do is you transform their longer answers into keywords or short phrases on the map. So, for example, an athlete could say, I don't know, my father is working with me every day, bringing me to training, and he's a very important person to help me progress. But you wouldn't write all that on the map because then the map just becomes way too populated. You would just say father or dad.
Keywords.
Sort of power. Exactly. You turn longer answers into those keywords. Or somebody might say, my coach is really not helping me right now, and you have a lot of problems with him. You would just write coach. And that way, when you explore physical environment, you explore social organizational environment, people around the athlete, what the athlete or the client does, so the tasks and the competitions they're in other life contexts to describe their external factors. Then you move to describing their personal descriptors, which include a question about physical traits, which go from injury to height to weight, for example. Then there's a question about global traits, that means who they are. They could speak about personality, intelligence, character, values, beliefs. There's a nice question about states, how they feel or how they experience determined situations. And then there's a question that differentiates your client from other people in their context. And all those questions are meant to describe personal descriptors. And in psychological skills, we mainly ask about strengths, weaknesses, and some coping strategies. Overall, we're going to have a map with something between, I would say, 20 and 60, 70 keywords that describe your client. And what the client does before we finish is they color those words. So they might underline them, or if you do a computer version, you might color the words from red, which means that's a concept that is very problematic in that topic. So we set the example of the coach. The coach is not helping at all, then we would color him red. And if daddy is helping a lot, then we would color him green. Red is very problematic. Orange is rather problematic. There are some things which are both problematic and helpful. We usually leave them the way they are. Then we have a lighter green for things that are rather helpful and a dark green for things that are very helpful. And what results is a very visually impactful map of keywords colored from red to green that give you an instant insight into who your client is in relation to that topic, that you can then use to plan further interviews, plan questionnaire administration, plan interventions, or just use it as a pre-test and then repeat the same map a couple of months later to see if anything has changed. Usually the clients take home that map. If it's a physical map, then you just give it to them. If it's an online map, you send them a PDF version, which changes a lot from usual interviewing practice where people talk and then they leave and they have paid for something, but it's bound to their memory to give it worth. This way they take something home, and I've seen athletes, I've been in dorm rooms of my athletes and seen the maps hung on the wall or as a computer screensaver. They become very meaningful parts of athletes. And that is, in a very quick description, the basic psych mapping exercise.
Perfect. From my perspective, I really like the versatility and the variety of fields that you can delve into and search alongside your client. And I think the client feels that way also. So, could you share some examples of how the tool has been used in practical settings? What are some success stories or outcomes that have been achieved using the tool? Of course, you can't say all the details because there's always the confidentiality of the data that the client shares with you, but just some general info and examples that come to your mind.
Okay, there are many success stories. I've hardly had any client who would not have benefited from the exercise. I wouldn't say the same thing about self-talk interventions, for example. If you think that I'm over-exaggerating, I'd say I've done plenty of self-talk interventions that were useless. But psych mapping always is. Let me see if I get a couple of examples. I think one that I liked very much was an injured athlete who had a 6-month injury, ACL injury. And I think a couple of weeks into his injury, we created a map about his injury recovery, where you had many things in red. Also highlighted, you can also highlight on the map things that you are especially important, such as the doctors were red, the coach was red, his own feelings, the injury was red, the pain was red. There was a lack of pain management skills, there was a lack of self-discipline. And we repeated that map. We took that map and we arranged it, or we amended it. We changed some words and changed the coloring every 2 weeks. And we could create like a really nice video almost, and seeing how concepts that were terribly red at the beginning started to become orange, then black, then green. And at the end, he could see how he grew through that injury with several, it was 8 maps that we created during his injury. And it ended up with a map very green, and you could really see how he gained psychological skills from that experience. And for even years later, it's now 2 years ago, he's still remembering what skills he acquired during that injury. So I think that was a very nice one. I really liked one story. We worked with an elite athlete, an NBA player, who, he wanted something from sports psychology that was very, very concrete, some sort of breathing techniques. And we did the breathing techniques. I'm not sure if they work at all, but I convinced him. I said, why don't we create a map? Would you like to create a map? It's for free. You don't have to pay. We just have a chat. It's online, of course. And let's see what happens. And once he saw the map, once he saw it was a huge map, it had about, I think, almost 100 concepts in it. It took us 2 hours to create the map. Usually it's about an hour, but that one was huge. And he saw all those things colored red and orange. And he said, now I understand everything that sports psychology could do for me. And I still coordinate or still supervise the sports psychologist who's been working with him ever since. And they work almost every 2 weeks. They have a 2-hour session. And for an NBA player to get 2 hours out of his week, it's not that easy. But he actually saw that sports psychology could do so much more than just breathing exercises. he feels encouraged. And they also repeat the map every 6-7 months, so he can see how he's improving some things and how other things are developing. And I think the other one is, and that's not my personal story, but I like it. I'm often asked, with what age do you start using psych mapping? And I always say 16. It's because I'm afraid of children, basically. But I have a colleague, and she started working with kids. That's always 2 years ago now, and they were 12 years old. Now, a 12-year-old will struggle, and she created the map with them, and she sat next to them, and there was a lot of manipulation and bias, of course, because she guided them. But she showed them how to be introspective, how to think about themselves. And 2 years later, she says that they are able to create a map of their own psychological reality, which is infinitely richer than some maps of their 18-year-old players who have never done psych mapping, which shows, and that's something I've experienced firsthand, and many of the colleagues in the community have experienced, that it shows that psych mapping is also metacognitive training. Because by creating a map, you see what you know about yourself, and then you take it home. And then you look at it after a bad day, you say, oh, there are things missing on that map. You look at the map after a good day and you say, oh, there are other things missing on the map. And there are some days you look at the map and you say, like, I really colored that green. That shouldn't be green. That should be red, or that should be orange. And you question yourself. And it becomes that metacognitive learning exercise. And after you repeat it a couple of times, not every week, that doesn't make sense, but every 6 months, every year once, you become much more of an expert in creating maps. And we even have athletes now who create maps as a homework. They lose a game and they create a map about that game and come to the session with a map and say, let's talk about what happened, which is absolutely amazing. But that kid, I like that story because, and I've seen a map of a 14-year-old, which is, I would say, I have university students who would struggle to create such precise introspection. And it comes from training. So that's just 3 success stories.
Perfect. And they're quite different between them. There are some differences between them. And of course, self-awareness for both the client and the practitioner is, I think, really something that you can achieve using sports psych mapping, and especially time and again and again and again. As you said, making a re-evaluation after a couple of months or some time after the first session is really useful. So, how do you envision the tool evolving or being further developed in the future? Are there any specific areas of improvement or expansion you have in mind?
Yes, there are 2 developments ongoing. Well, there are 3 developments ongoing. Let me just mention. People really like the psych mapping exercise, but I would say that the most important thing is the theory behind it. And we are now developing the theory from the knowledge map, which was the earlier version, which wasn't meant to be a theory. It was just a summary of what sport and exercise psychology has studied. And it's really nice to see it. I mean, I recommend it. You don't really need to read the paper. Just have a look at the images. They're really nice. Like read the paper too, but now we are creating a psych mapping model, which is meant to be a global holistic theory that explains people and their behavior. So that's one development. It is an applied theory. Everything we do, we usually create it in a triangle. Usually it's me who's leading the development together with other colleagues. Then we have applied partners. Well, let's start here. We have academic partners. So our academic partners, we have a university in Greece, in Norway, in Germany, in the USA, in Spain, in England. And we ask them if what we did is correct, because we want things to be science-based. We ask absolute world-leading experts, does that make sense? Is that still correct? And then we go into clubs. So we have applied partners in professional football, professional basketball, but also mental health provision and other sports, and multi-sport agencies. And we ask them if it is useful. So we ask our community members, which are mostly sports psychologists, is this useful to you? Because we have so many theoretical developments which are useless. We need something that is useful. And that's how we create that exercise. We're going to publish an article if we're allowed to publish it, of course. And we have commissioned a book from Taylor and Francis in English. It's going to appear probably late 2024. I know there's still a lot of time to go, but if you're very interested in that, you can look me
We're
up on
looking
LinkedIn.
forward to it for sure.
Yes, and on LinkedIn there's the discussion we had, so you have to go a little bit back, but you can find some excerpts of the theory and have a look. Okay, so that's one thing, and then we are reviewing the basic psych mapping exercise I've been talking about just a minute ago. It's not that the old version isn't good. We just wanted to, we have every time more and more new experiences. And some of my colleagues, some of our community members had used different questions, adapted questions differently. We have a new theory, which make us think and, changing things slightly. So we're testing a slightly different version. Not very different. I'd say it's 9 out of 13 questions are the same, and then 4 have changed a little bit. And it's going to give people more alternatives when creating their own psych mapping. Because psych mapping is, in a sense, a set of guidelines, not a set of rules. You can adapt them. All the materials we share in our community are PDF, PowerPoint versions. You can just change the wording, change the phrases, change the questions, delete a question, add a question, put your logo in, change the colors, whatever you want. So that is one thing we do. We do it in a multi-linguistic way as well. I think we have it's Greece, it's Serbia, it's Spain, I think we have somebody in South America, we have somebody in Malaysia. So we're looking also at the multicultural aspect of the psych mapping exercise. I think that's going to be a really nice one. I envision it could be published by the end of this year, early 2024, because it takes a bit of time to convince the reviewers, because they don't like us too much. But that's okay, that's fine. And the third one is we're creating a health behavior version of psych mapping. Psych mapping can be actually adapted or applied to every context. It's just the professional, the practitioner, needs to change a little bit the wording. As I said at the beginning, Lucia, she was also a co-author of the sports psych mapping article, which is where the basic psych mapping exercise is explained. She used it with cybersecurity programs to our problem. But we did develop a specific version for health behavior change. So somebody who wants to stop smoking, somebody who wants to start eating healthier, or somebody who wants to start doing exercise regularly. And it just explores the facilitators and barriers for that behavior change. And we're going to start the validation process, I hope, very soon. And from there we go, and we hope to publish somewhere in 2024 the official health behavior mapping version.
Perfect. I was about to ask you next regarding the scientific base of psych mapping tool, but your answer has covered this question. It's obvious that psych mapping is strongly scientifically based, with continuous researches being conducted and papers being reviewed and published. And this is something really important. And what I also like is that it is not something stagnant. It's not that you created an initial version of psych mapping, let's say 2 years ago, and that's it for the rest of the years. You are continuously asking yourself, how can we improve that? What can we do to make it better? You don't have a fear to to criticize yourself for the tool and find advantages and disadvantages. And this is something really interesting, really helpful for the advancement of this tool. So, what advice you mentioned as well at the end of your answer that you are trying to validate and start using it in the mental health sector, and that was another question I wanted to ask you regarding the general population, and how can people not only sports psychologists or related to the sports psychology field, how can they be trained and start using this tool? Let's say coaches or athletes or members of general population who are interested in incorporating the tool into their daily programs? How can they get started and make the most of its capabilities?
Well, you can read, of course, you can read the article, you can see some of the videos we have on YouTube or on Twitter or LinkedIn. You can make yourself an idea. But I would recommend investing a little bit of time and very little bit of money on the basic courses we have. So there is an official course, it's called the PsychMapping Foundation course. It's done by the University of Suffolk. It's easily found on our website, psychmapping.com. It's £45 in euros, for example, that's about 50 euros. It's an online asynchronous course, everybody can do it. And you get every material and everything you need to actually apply it in your everyday practice. It's not only meant for psychologists or sports psychologists, and we have a nice amount of nutritionists doing the course, for example, because they found out
That's
that
interesting.
prescribing, because so what they tell me is we make nutrition plans for individuals which are barely ever followed, because people slip up and they change, and they use psych mapping to create a map of why people would or wouldn't follow their nutrition plan. And then besides prescribing them or suggesting them what to eat, they can also work together with their clients without being psychologists, just common sense, have a conversation about, how can we make something change? I remember one girl told me, yes, so we found out that a woman's husband was a very negative influence for her behavior change, because the husband would be more hedonistic, let's say. So he would like to go out and have dinner and have a beer and a barbecue, whereas the wife wanted to lose weight and eat healthily. And the husband, whenever he saw, a salad, he would leave the house running to the pub. So they sat together, and then they had a meeting with the husband as well, and showed him like his influence on that, and they worked around that, so they avoided that as a barrier. It's just a small example of somebody who's not even a psychologist using it. We have quite a lot of sport coaches, physiotherapists, strength and conditioning coaches doing the course for two reasons. Some do it because they want to use psych mapping with athletes. Most of them, they can't afford sports psychologists and on the team level. Some of them do the psych mapping exercise for the team, so they ask the question and try to imagine how the athletes would answer. It gives them a better way of putting themselves in athletes' shoes. And we have quite a few of them who just say, my sports psychology training was awful. They didn't like it, or most tell me they were way too young, way too immature to appreciate the 2 hours of sports psychology training they received in their coaching courses. And now that they've been coaching for a couple of years, they notice that psychology is important. And even though you don't have a sports psychologist, the psychology is still there.
Yes.
And they like the theory part because it tells them, it just teaches them what sports psychology is and what, how people function. So we have a few people. I would recommend the course online, but there are also community members. Sports psych mapping is also a community. And some of them, they organize courses. I think we had 2 in Hungary, and we had one in South America, and there's going to be another one in South America, I think, this month. But any community member is absolutely free to do a course, and they can do it for free. They can charge for it, and that's one very important thing for me. Psych mapping doesn't belong to me or to Edu or to anyone. And that's why we keep developing it. And that's why we invite people to be part of the community, because we want this just simply to be something that has an impact. And it doesn't belong to us. We published it, and right now I lead it, but I really hope somebody's going to take it away from me in a not so distant future, so I can do something else. So do the course, be part. Once you've done a course, keep offering, developing. And it's not only for psychologists. You can't do psychology only having done the course, but you can use psych mapping, definitely.
Yes. That's something that I also found out is it's practical, because nutritionists and physiotherapists mostly ask me as well Do you have any recommendation, something that you can suggest to me to use for my clients as a nutritionist or as a physiotherapist? And for me, it is clear that psych mapping tool is going to be practically helpful for them in their work with the client, with the examples that you mentioned before. And as you said, this community of psych mapping is something that is really hopeful and gives us big hopes for the future and how psych mapping can evolve and develop further in the future. Okay, I think this was a delightful conversation. Alex, thank you very much for the time, information, insightful thoughts you shared with us. It was, for me also, it was a great pleasure to talk with you.
Yeah, thank you. It was fun. I hope people enjoyed it.
Yes, of course. We also thank people, you, for hearing us. You can find further information and some main web pages, including info about Alexander Latinjak and the psych mapping tool in the description below this podcast video. You can also like this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel and follow me to keep track with all the latest content we upload regarding sports psychology and other stuff. So goodbye to everybody.